I just realized that I'm not going to be able to continue season 5B or into the future.
For 5 seasons, Kevin Costner was Yellowstone. As John Dutton, the iron-jawed patriarch of the Dutton Ranch, he anchored a show that grew into the most-watched drama on American television. Then, seemingly overnight, he was gone, and the character he had built for half a decade was killed off in an episode he had no hand in writing. For years, the public was fed a simple story. An aging star had gotten too big for the job, demanded a lighter workload, and walked away from a franchise that revived his career. Now at 71, with the dust long settled on Yellowstone, and his own life rebuilt from the wreckage of a bitter divorce, the full picture of what actually happened looks very different from the headlines that once defined him. Yellowstone premiered in the summer of 2018 and grew, season by season, into something closer to a cultural institution than a cable drama. By its 5th season, it was regularly pulling in double-digit millions of viewers, at times outperforming broadcast network programming entirely. At the center of all of it stood Costner's John Dutton, a rancher fighting to hold onto land, family, and a version of the American West that the modern world kept trying to bulldoze. Dutton wasn't simply the lead role. He was the gravitational center the entire show orbited. Every subplot, from Beth and Jamie's sibling war to the constant threat of developers circling the ranch, existed in relation to him. Costner brought a lived-in, weathered gravity to the part that reviewers and fans alike compared to his earlier work in the Western genre, work that, decades earlier, had made him one of Hollywood's defining stars. What audiences didn't see was the structure underneath that success. Costner was the face of Yellowstone, its highest-paid performer, and its emotional core, but he never controlled the scripts. That power belonged entirely to creator Taylor Sheridan and the show's producing partners. It's a detail that seems small until it becomes the hinge on which the entire ending turns. To understand how seriously Costner took the Western as a genre and why its collapse hit him so hard, it helps to look at where he came from. Born in 1955 and raised across several small California towns as his father moved for work, Costner grew up without much of a fixed home. He studied marketing in college and, by his own account, was headed toward an ordinary life before a chance conversation on an airplane changed his direction. Seated near veteran actor Richard Burton, Costner asked whether he should gamble on acting. Burton's advice was blunt enough to push him into it, and within weeks Costner had quit his job and moved toward Hollywood. The years that followed were rough. He worked odd jobs to pay for acting classes, and in Hollywood's unsentimental slang of the era, actors like him were dismissively called the face on the cutting room floor, a nod to how often their scenes were the first things cut. His earliest credited role, in The Big Chill, was trimmed down to almost nothing. The breakthrough came gradually, a supporting part in 1985 Western Silverado, followed by a run of hits, The Untouchables, Bull Durham, Field of Dreams, that turned him into one of the most bankable leading men in the country by the late 1980s. Then, in 1990, he made the gamble that would define his legacy, directing and starring in Dances with Wolves, a 3-hour Western spoken largely in Lakota, which the industry had privately written off before it even opened. It went on to win 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. That triumph was followed later in the decade by expensive missteps. Waterworld and The Postman both underperformed and became shorthand in the industry for a director star reaching too far. A serious car accident in 2008 left lasting damage to his hand. Through it all, though, the Western kept pulling him back, culminating in 2003's Open Range, and a decade later, a supporting Emmy win for the miniseries Hatfields and McCoys, a role that quietly reopened the door to television for a man who had spent his career avoiding it. By the time Yellowstone came calling in 2018, Costner wasn't chasing a comeback. He was stepping into a part that felt, as he later described it, tailor-made for everything he'd spent decades building. The public narrative around Costner's exit took shape slowly through a stream of unnamed sources and trade reports over roughly 2 years. The version that stuck was simple. Costner wanted to shrink his workload, reportedly down to as little as 1 week of shooting for the back half of the final season, and the show's producers were left scrambling to accommodate a star who no longer wanted to be there. Costner never publicly rebutted that story in real time. For months, he let it stand, and the silence did what silence usually does. It let the least generous version of events calcify into accepted fact. The full account, when it eventually came out, painted a far messier picture. According to Costner's own later testimony and reporting from entertainment outlets that covered the dispute closely, the real breakdown began in early 2023, when scripts for the second half of Season 5 simply stopped arriving. Production stalled. Costner has said there was a stretch of roughly 14 months in which he had no finished pages to work from, not a scheduling standoff, but an absence of material to shoot at all. At the same time, Costner's contract had reportedly guaranteed him a role through Seasons 5, 6, and 7. When producers moved to split the final season into two halves, 5A and 5B, without the security he believed he'd been promised, tension between his camp and the studio deepened. His attorney at the time pushed back hard against the diva framing that had taken hold in the press, calling the narrative inaccurate and pointing instead to the missing scripts as the actual source of the delay. Money became part of the story too, but in a way that cuts against a greedy star narrative rather than supporting it. Costner has stated that when negotiations for a potential sixth season took place, the offer on the table was lower than what he'd been paid for earlier seasons, not higher. He asked for roughly $12 million per season, a figure in line with his prior deals, and has said that once a number was reached, it was the studio that walked away from the table, not him. Then came the detail that turned a contract dispute into something closer to a public reckoning. According to industry newsletter reporting, Costner had pushed for a form of veto power over how his character could be written out, sometimes described as a moral death clause specifying acceptable ways for Dutton's story to end. Whether or not the show honored the spirit of that arrangement became its own point of quiet contention once the finale aired. What made 2023 especially brutal for Costner wasn't just the unraveling at Yellowstone, it was that his personal life fell apart in the exact same window. In May of that year, the same period his professional future was making headlines, his wife of 18 years, Christine Baumgartner, filed for divorce. The two crises didn't happen in isolation. They collided, and each one made the other harder to manage. The divorce quickly turned combative. There were disputes over a prenuptial agreement, a court order requiring Baumgartner to vacate the family home, and an extended fight over child support for their 3 children. Baumgartner's side initially sought a monthly figure north of $160,000. Costner's team argued for far less. A Santa Barbara judge eventually settled on an amount well below what had been requested but still substantial, a ruling that left both sides publicly unsatisfied. The financial stakes of the Yellowstone dispute bled directly into the divorce proceedings because Costner's income and his choices about work were now legal evidence. During a September 2023 child support hearing, he was pressed by Baumgartner's attorney about his earnings and his standing on the show. It was there under oath that Costner gave his most detailed public account of what had actually happened, describing stalled negotiations, a lower financial offer than in previous seasons, and creative disagreements that never got resolved. He acknowledged he might ultimately take legal action against the production over how his departure had been handled. It was a strange, almost surreal moment, a man testifying about the end of his marriage while simultaneously being forced to explain, in the same breath, the end of the biggest role of his career. To outside observers, some of his choices, turning down a guaranteed multimillion-dollar payday while fighting a costly custody and support battle, looked hard to reconcile. To Costner, by his own account, the money was never really the point. Underneath all of it sat Horizon, an American saga, a 4-part Western epic Costner had wanted to make for decades and had struggled for years to get financed. Unable to secure full studio backing, he ultimately committed a significant amount of his own money to get off the ground, a bet strikingly similar to the one he'd made with Dances with Wolves more than 30 years earlier. Horizon's shooting schedule depended heavily on gaps in Yellowstone's production calendar. As Yellowstone's own schedule kept slipping, thanks to the missing scripts and the broader industry work stoppages of 2023, the window to shoot Horizon kept closing in on itself. Costner has said he adjusted and delayed his own film's production more than once to try to accommodate Yellowstone, at real financial cost to himself, only to have the show's side of the schedule never materialize. Eventually, something had to give. In June 2024, Costner confirmed publicly that he would not be returning to Yellowstone. It wasn't framed as a dramatic ultimatum. By that point, the two production calendars had simply become impossible to reconcile, and he chose to finish the project he'd spent his own money and years chasing. The show's creator, Taylor Sheridan, addressed the split publicly not long after it was confirmed that Yellowstone would end with the second half of Season 5. He acknowledged feeling disappointed about how Dutton's story would be resolved, noting that the shortened arrangement would compress the character's ending rather than fundamentally change it. In later interviews, Sheridan gave more context on the broader arc of Costner's involvement, suggesting that Costner's original commitment had been for a shorter run than the show ultimately asked of him, and that the network's desire to keep the show's biggest asset on board for as long as possible had created strain over time. It was, in effect, an acknowledgement that the show's own success and its reluctance to let go of what was working played a role in the eventual breakdown. However Sheridan characterized it, the practical result was the same. John Dutton's ending was written and filmed without Costner's direct involvement in shaping it, and Costner has said he first learned the specifics of how his character's story concluded much the same way audiences did. Horizon, an American saga, the project at the center of so much of this, has not had the outcome Costner was hoping for. Its first chapter opened to a modest box office return relative to its budget, and the planned second chapter was pulled from its release date and has yet to be rescheduled. Costner has spoken about seeking additional financing to complete the remaining films in the saga, meaning the full financial and creative verdict on the gamble is still unresolved. Looking back at the 2 years between early 2023 and mid-2024, what emerges isn't the story of a star who simply lost interest in a hit show. It's the story of overlapping pressures, a stalled writer's room, a contract renegotiation that broke down over money and creative control, a very public divorce playing out in the same courtroom, where his professional grievances were aired, and a passion project that consumed both his money and his calendar at the exact moment his television career needed him most available. Any one of those pressures might have been survivable on its own. Together, they made staying on Yellowstone functionally impossible, whatever the tabloid headlines chose to say at the time. Costner, now in his early 70s, has continued to describe his exit less as a grievance and more as the byproduct of a production that couldn't deliver the material he needed to do his job, a distinction that got lost for a long time under a much simpler, much less accurate story about a star who thought he'd outgrown the show that made him one. What his testimony ultimately clarified wasn't that Yellowstone's ending was a betrayal or a conspiracy. It was something more mundane and in some ways more familiar to anyone who has watched a long-running hit show try to hold itself together. A production stretched past its breaking point, a star caught between two competing dreams, and a public left, for years, with only half the story.